The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy.
Empathy is what has made our species so successful in the sense of, we're 8.2 billion strangers. And so dehumanization is really a literal thing about plugging into the neural networks and taking away the human beingness of somebody else. Let's say 5 non-psychopaths and 1 psychopath, and everyone talks about their feelings. And what happened was that increased the recidivism of the psychopaths. I've written about heartbreak in my last book, Livewired, and what I think it is the same thing as drug withdrawal. AI is asking us to question everything.
But can you tell us what you think dreaming is?
Yes.
I think what's crazy is that we know, if we're being honest with each other, what causes the majority of the problems on this planet. Hold on, let me finish before you write something in the comments you may later regret, because it means we also know where the majority of the solutions lay. And this can be very challenging for people to contend with on a daily basis, because it requires this comprehensive, if not imperfect, mix of empathy and understanding and patience and personal accountability. And somehow you have to weave all that together into action. But the reason you can't is because of the same thing that's causing all the problems on the planet. But here's the thing, sometimes it's not even your thing that's causing the problems on the planet or in your life, it's somebody else's. And all of this power rests in something that can fit in the palm of your hand. And depending on what you bring into the party, 3 pounds? 1.5 kilos? Think an awful lot about what Jeffrey Eugenides wrote, great author, Middlesex, when he said that biology gives you a brain, but life turns it into a mind, and you need to protect that mind. What did Billy Shakes write in Othello? Would not put a thief into my mouth to steal my brains. 86 billion plus neurons firing a bunch of little lightning storms that trigger cravings, remind you of things you wished you would never think of again, bring a sense of love and joy into your heart, spin dreams, help you fall for propaganda, somehow make you look at another human being not like a human being at all. What is grief? Why does heartache feel the way it does? Can a bad person become a good person? And this all fascinates me, especially if you don't have the luxury or the cop-out of, well, it's a higher power. But no, if you have to live in the here and now and try to make things better in the here and now, why does this thing do all of that? That's why I love talking to neuroscientists. I want to introduce you to one now, best-selling author as well. But what I really like about him is that he is an explorer of the mind, Dr. David Eagleman.
Dr. David Eagleman. David, it's really nice to see you again. Thanks for taking the time. And I know you just rushed home from class where you were teaching. Yeah. How did it go today?
It went great. And thanks, George. It's great to see you again.
What were you teaching? What's on the agenda this year?
This quarter is literature and the brain. And I've always found this fascinating that we usually study the brain and we think about, okay, how do the eyes work and how do the ears work and decision-making and so on. But in fact, so much of the brain is able to slip off into another slipstream of a story. You open a book with, these arbitrary squiggles on the page, and woof, suddenly you're the protagonist. You're Jon Snow or Daenerys Targaryen or whatever, and you're living their life and feeling their emotions. You're laughing, you're crying. It's just so easy for brains to slip into a different consciousness, and I love that, and that's what this class is about.
It's one of the things that makes me think we're not actually who we think we are. We've just been in this character slipstream for long enough that we're us.
That's a good one. And in fact, we change so much from day to day even, and yet we have this sense of a long-term average. So we say, oh yeah, I know who I am. But in fact, you can be a very different person in different moments.
How important is it for somebody in your position to approach this without judgment?
Oh, I think I don't ever have any judgment on it, just because I know that brains are really different. Even within a household, brains are really different. I mean, forgetting generational differences, we all are born, we all drop into the world with a certain set of genes, and that defines sort of, if you think of like a cone and we're starting at the point of the cone, defines this space of what we can become. And then where we actually take our trajectory in that cone, that has everything to do with the experiences we're having in the world. So the nature versus nurture question is totally dead in science because the answer is always both. But, genes matter. Like I wish I could be as good a swimmer as Michael Phelps, but he's got a larger wingspan than I do. There's no way I'll ever be as good as him. And experiences matter. If you grow up in a great house versus a terrible household, if you have great teachers versus terrible teachers, these things make a big difference.
How much can you undo? And because what you brought up, we just talked to Dr. Mate. He'll come on again, and one of the things he connects a lot of this back to is trauma, and understanding trauma really affects how you can approach what you do with your brain and how much control you actually have. Where are you in the you have control versus you don't have as much control conversation?
Yeah, you have some amount of control. So obviously confronting trauma and going through the work to try to deal with it, super important. But could I become a super, super different person than I am now? Probably not. I mean, when you look at somebody, let's say a forensic psychiatrist in the Southwest where I grew up, and he dealt with all these mass murder cases, and he would do these depositions with these mass murders. And he told me from a young age, he said, the thing is, you can't put yourself in other people's shoes as much as you think you can and you'd like to. The fact is, there's just a ton of difference from brain to brain. And if you look at the faces in a crowd, you see how different people's faces are. There's just that much different on the inside as well.
Right. That's incredible, by the way, because we live in a society where we are trying to pass laws, create rules, have guardrails, understand how we're all supposed to engage in some version of a social contract. But if the multitudes exist that way, how could society ever possibly come up with a set of rules or understandings?
Right. So, by the way, this is the topic of the next book that I'm writing. It's called Empire of the Invisible, and it's all about how little of the world we actually see, but yet we all think we see everything. We know all the truth, and we all have the impression, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, you have the impression that if you could just shout loudly enough in all capital letters on Twitter, that everyone would come to see the truth of what you're saying, and everyone who doesn't agree with you is a troll or misinformed or obstreperous, and everyone on all sides of the spectrum deep down really believes this, which is, okay, I see the truth and I don't know what those other idiots are doing. And I find that fascinating. I'm writing this book from a meta-political perspective. In other words, I'm not taking anybody's side. I'm just addressing why we believe our truths, even though we are so limited in what we can see.
When you're going through all this, though, and you're learning all this, are you internally in your own life not taking a side? Because is there a subjective truth or an objective truth?
I don't know that there's an objective truth. When you get 8.2 billion people together on a planet with all these different needs and ideas and biases, it's very hard to imagine that there's some objective truth. And I think we can know that just by looking around. No one has ever posted an idea on X or Facebook or anywhere where all 365 million Americans looked at it and said, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't we vote for this guy? That's just never happened and never will happen. And what that illustrates, I mean, what I find interesting, whenever I walk into a bookstore, I watch the crowd going through there. People come in the bookstore and no one ever spends equal time in all the sections. People buzz over to the thing that they want, whether that's Westerns or romances or sci-fi or nonfiction or whatever. And I just find that interesting. People have different internal lives and different desires and different things that they want. Obviously, this is what we see politically all the time. What it has done for me, in answer to your question, is I'm much less able to take anything too seriously, by which I mean, taking up arms and fighting and dying for some particular political position is, it's just more difficult when you really look at the complexity of all these issues. In other words, I'm always surprised that there exist hot button issues that people will say, I am absolutely clear on it, and the other 50% of the country, they're idiots.
A friend of mine worked in neuroscience in Europe, and one of the things, and he struggled with it a little bit. He had a very political ideology in his own life, but he started to struggle with the fact that the only place he could make money doing this in his way was by working with companies in marketing. So he used his understanding of the brain to market things to people. And it's really interesting how, as little as we know about the brain, one thing we do know is that one of the many things we know is how easily suggestible we are, and that politicians and social media, everybody's figured out in a way how to hack our brains and get that point across. You must see that all the time in your research.
Sure. I mean, the interesting part is that people who go into, let's say, neuromarketing, they're playing catch up with hundreds of years of people doing this. I mean, it's a fancier term for what advertisers have always known about what it is to, round a price to 99 cents and, going fast, this offer won't last, and on and on. This stuff has been discovered for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So there's nothing too new from the neuroscience point of view, except maybe an explanation for why it works here and there. But yes, we are easily hackable. I got to be a scientific advisor on the show Westworld, and that's one of my favorite lines from that excellent show is, this idea that humans are hackable. This is the situation we're in. It's so easy, whether that comes to seduction or selling you something or impressing you that, I'm a political figure with the right, mission for this country or whatever it is. It's just not that hard to get people to agree on things.
I years ago I worked on a documentary series called Love, Hate, and Propaganda, and it was one module was about World War II, one was about the Cold War, and the other one was what was being called the War on Terror. And it was how the governments from all sides and actors used propaganda to influence people to get the world to commit pretty heinous crimes against each other. I wondered, in a digital era, flickering blue lights, the way our brains are working, the online, the digital native people, how propaganda is changed, or how the way they reach us has changed, if it has at all.
I'm so glad we're talking about this. Yeah, I've been studying propaganda for a long time from a neuroscience point of view. And there's actually a lot we can come to understand there. So, for example, the whole key with propaganda is about dehumanizing the enemy, literally. So when we look at other humans, when I'm thinking about, hey, what am I going to say to George? And, when I see him in person, I'll take him to a coffee or lunch or whatever. I'm doing all these computations in my brain about another human being. And it turns out we have a lot of circuitry devoted to that. But if I'm dealing with not a human being, but instead my iPad or some headphones or something, then it's different circuitry that's involved. And I wouldn't care about, whatever, throwing the headphones in the trash if they're broken or something. So it turns out that when you dehumanize an enemy, thinking about them moves from that circuitry where you're thinking about a fellow human to thinking about something like an object. And so all propaganda all throughout the ages always has exactly the same properties, which is it's comparing the enemy to an animal, or more recently a virus or insects, things like that, such that that changes the way the population views them, and they don't care about, let's say, killing them in the same way that you wouldn't care that much about killing a cockroach. You're able to do it, even if you're a little disgusted by it. Doesn't bother you that much to do it. And so dehumanization is really a literal thing about plugging into the neural networks and taking away the human beingness of somebody else.
So it's essentially, a version of this, not to be crude about it, it's that person who's pulling the lever that switches the train to a different set of tracks in the brain. And for some people, it takes more or less effort to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And all the mechanisms for this are the same across all places and time. So yes, comparing the enemy to an animal, the United States does this just like Japan and Germany did this. I mean, everybody does this to the enemy. Other things involve moral pollution. And we see this a lot with arguments going on now where people will say, oh, well, if you think that, then you're like Hitler, or you're, plug in the bad person or bad virus or bad whatever. And it becomes harder to hear somebody's arguments once you think, okay, well, I've already got them classified. They're like little Hitlers there, or whatever the thing is. So there are many ways to do this. And this is actually what my next book is about, is this issue of how do we become a little bit broader in our thinking? How do we expand our internal model so that we recognize that everyone has their own internal model going on? Everyone's essentially living on their own planet. How do we take our own models slightly less seriously and put the effort into trying to understand someone else's point of view? That's not the same as saying you're agreeing with them or you'll come to, find that thing compelling, but at least it's just trying to understand, okay, what is it like to be them?
Dehumanizing feels like getting the tube out of the toothpaste. Is the same, like the rehumanizing seems much more difficult to do. Is there any circuitry that can do that?
Yeah, there are ways to rehumanize. It's actually, it's straightforward enough because if you come to see somebody else as caring about any of the things that you care about, that's where it all starts. And in fact, so I've got this idea about starting a new social media, and the idea would be, instead of magnifying the posts that cause the most, sow the most division, what if instead, let's say, George, that I like, hang gliding and you like hang gliding, and I like this particular kind of German Shepherd dog and you happen to love exactly that dog and so on. So every time we're posting, what the algorithm is doing is simply finding what we have in common that we like. And then one day, some months from now, some years from now, we discover that we actually have totally opposite political views on some issue. Well, at that point, you're already my buddy. And I say, oh, George, tell me about that. Why do you think that? As opposed to that being the first thing that we find out about. So rehumanizing has to do a lot with this, life is complex and there can be this real cross-stitching of allegiances and things that we care about. And if we have things in common, then it's okay if there's a couple things that are not in common.
Okay, so I don't know how well you do, if you do really know Elon Musk or whatever, but there was a quote floating around from him that he said that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. He called that the fundamental weakness. And this is the opposite of what you're talking about doing here.
Wow. I wonder what was the context in which he said that?
I think he was talking about, he's an expansionist. So he was talking about expansionism, nice. And that empathy is what holds us back. But you're looking at it from a completely different point.
Right. So I'm fascinated by empathy because, so let me say a few things about that. One is, empathy is what has made our species so successful, in the sense of, we're 8.2 billion strangers, and yet we cooperate and have made this incredible planet with, symphonies and skyscrapers and so on. Precisely because we can say, hey, I wonder what it's like to be that guy and to feel the way that guy's feeling and so on. So we're actually quite good at empathy. But the interesting part is that it is limited, and it depends on your in-groups and your out-groups. So we did a study in my lab some years ago where we put people in the brain scanner, what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging. We put them in the scanner and we show 6 hands on the screen. And the computer goes around boop, 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 and picks one of the hands. And then you see that hand get stabbed with a syringe needle. And when you see that, that really, what happens is this network lights up in your brain that we summarize as the pain matrix. It's a series of areas. That would be the same if your hand was stabbed. Of course, it's not your hand that's stabbed. You're just watching someone else's hand get stabbed. But this is the neural basis of empathy. Now, that was the first part of the experiment. But then what we did is we labeled each hand with a one-word label: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Scientologist, Hindu, atheist. And now, computer goes around, picks a hand. You see that hand get stabbed, and the question is, whatever group you belong to, does your brain care when it sees a member of one of your outgroups getting stabbed? And the answer is your brain does not care as much. Whatever group you belong to, you care more about that getting stabbed. By the way, this is not even an indictment of religion, because you see the same thing with atheists. They care more about atheist hands getting stabbed, and they care less about their outgroups. So it's this is your brain's first response. This is, so this doesn't necessarily map onto your behavior, because you might think, I don't like this guy's member of my outgroup, but nonetheless, I'll do the right thing. But your brain's first response is all about, is he on my team or is he on another team? So empathy is something that is dialed by whether you see somebody as in your in-group or out-group.
I'm as a layperson in this, and somebody who spends my life in the heads of strangers, cultivating conversations that I hope will help somebody go to bed either feeling a little better, being a little lovely, or knowing a little more than they woke up. One of the things that I've come to realize over time is that I think it's so important to do those things that you don't want to do and to see things from perspectives you don't want to see it, if only just to push your brain to not just be a defense mechanism machine or a prediction machine. And I think
Yeah.
one way to really push it and test those values are with people who are in your out group.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, one of the things, this is a side note, but one of the things that Hollywood does so well and has been doing is this is sort of the first place that a lot of people get to experience something of an out group, which is to say, you know, the Cosby Show in the 80s was the first time for many people that they got to be part of an African American family and be living in their living room and so on. And, a friend of mine was just saying how her grandmother watched Will and Grace years ago, and then ended up concluding, hey, I really like gay people, and this is a really great way is through literature and storytelling and Hollywood in many cases, opening up these worlds for us. And hopefully that is a stepping stone to us actually having conversations with people that are on the other side of the aisle from us.
Yeah. I want to run a couple things by you. I want to keep you for a little bit longer, but there's a couple things that I think a lot about when people are watching. What happens to the brain when your heart breaks? We're going to go on like this kind of path. What happens to your brain when your heart breaks, and can you do anything about it?
Yeah. So I've written about heartbreak in my last book, Livewired, and what I think it is the same thing as drug withdrawal, which is to say the way a drug works is, you're putting this drug in your body and your brain comes to expect the presence of that physically. It's expressing more receptors for that drug, and that's why you need more and more of the drug to achieve the same hit. But what happens when you suddenly cease the drug is that it's very painful because your brain has expected that to be in the world. Well, it's the same thing with heartbreak. Your brain expects the presence of some person there. And whether that person has died or has left you or whatever the situation is, your brain is yearning for that person. Our brains are extraordinarily social. So much of our circuitry has to do with other people. And so that other person has become part of you physically. And now your brain has to deal with their absence. So that's what I think the analogy is drug withdrawal.
I mean, there's almost no easy way to quit drugs. So getting through heartbreak is just time and discipline.
That's exactly right. And, seeking new things to overwrite experiences and all the basic things like getting, good sleep and exercise. And that's all you can do. And you just have to wait for those memories to mellow. We all know what it's like, for example, when a loved one dies and it's so painful at first, but eventually it becomes something that you look back on, and it can be even a warm memory about the person. When you think back on them, it makes you smile. But that just takes time.
It's strange how normal it can become over time. It's strange how your brain can do that. So going to the gym and getting sleep helps you rewrite. So when people break up with somebody or get dumped and they go to the gym out of revenge to look better, it's actually also helping them heal.
Well, that's right. In part because you're just kicking yourself out of this, endless washing machine brain of recycling this stuff over and over.
So grief and heartbreak are the same thing, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are your kids school-age children now?
They are.
So knowing what you know, are we doing the education system the right way?
You know what? The answer is that is changing very rapidly in 2025, meaning AI is asking us to question everything now. If you have something that knows everything and can brilliantly synthesize it, what is the point of teaching a child geometry and this history thing and this whatever? I'm not saying there's no point, but it is really causing us to question what should we do with our schools. And I think happily at the beginning, one of the things we can do straight away is really take advantage of AI tutors and also using AI to reduce the burden on teachers. That's an easy one. This can really help teachers a lot in terms of producing the exams and grading things and keeping careful track of the children all throughout the semester, every answer they make on everything, so you know where they are instead of having to wait for the end of semester exam, stuff like this. But we are going to learn so much in the next little while about what it is we want to train our kids for. I'll just tell you my position, which is roots and wings, as the German writer Goethe said 200 years ago. These are the two bequests that we need to give our children. Roots meaning, what has come before them, and wings meaning creativity. And so I think it is useful to teach kids critical thinking. And on this point, let me just mention, I think one of the most exciting things that's going on with AI, which ties back to the conversation we were having, is AI can have a debate with a student. You pick any hot button issue, abortion, gun control, whatever you want, and the student takes a side and the AI takes a side, and the student gets graded on the quality of their argument against the AI on this. And then the student gets graded on how well they can steel man the AI's argument. In other words, how well they can represent, all right, look, here's the argument that you gave me and why it's strong and blah, blah, blah. And then they switch sides and they get graded again. And to my mind, that kind of critical thinking, that kind of taking perspective and understanding different points of view and making decisions, that is gold. And there's no way that any teacher would have enough patience and time to do that with each student, but that we can do with AI. And that's a sense in which you can get the roots, the critical thinking. And as far as the creativity goes, boy, that's terrific. I mean, there's so much that children can do now with creativity at a much higher level than we ever had that chance. Because, just like when we took, I don't know, like if you took calligraphy in school or something, and then that got completely replaced when PowerPoint came out. Now kids can say, hey, I want to make a video that takes into account this and AI footage and that. I mean, they can make extraordinary things now.
But one of the memes that I see floating around, I'm sure you've seen it too, is that we're using AI currently to make our songs and make our art. I wish we could make AI to do our dishes and our laundry so I can be free to make my art and make my songs.
Here's what I'd say. Yeah, that's right. Well, we're getting there fast. I mean, that's all going to happen in the next few years. People are taking these large language models and using them for robotics, meaning in the same way that you'd say, look, given all these words, what's the word that would best come next? You do the same thing with a robot's movement. Given all these positions of my arm, where should the next position of my arm be? It's exactly the same stuff. So we're getting there, but I tell you, I think this is all analogous to when the camera was invented, when photography was invented. All the visual painters panicked because they thought, God, we're done. Like, why would anybody want one of my paintings when you can just point this camera and capture a scene perfectly? But the answer is visual painting did not go away. Instead, photography and painting flowered on neighboring fields.
Right.
And I think this is going to be the same thing with a lot of what we're seeing with the creative things that AI can do. We'll have, AI versions of things, and we'll have human versions of things. And by the way, as humans, we really value the heartbeat behind the page or behind the piece of art. And so I think we'll always value what humans are doing, and we'll see.
This is what I think. That's what I think. I think I think there's a group of us that will always want human beings to make things because that's the story. And if our brains are story machines and everything is story, I'll want real stories as opposed to a non-real story. I don't know how many people want that. I don't know what the brain science is, but that's how I hope it goes.
Look, I'll tell you it was about a year and a half ago, Reid Hoffman announced, he said, hey, I've written a book and it was half written by me and half written by AI. And I immediately thought, not interested. I mean, I'm sure it's a good book and I like Reid Hoffman, but I thought I don't want to read something that's half written by AI. And why? It's because we care about the effort of other humans.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you predict violent behavior by studying a brain scan?
People have been trying this since at least the 1980s. The answer in some ways is yes, there are violent people, and it is no surprise that those violent people keep doing violent things. But what's interesting is you can't predict with any specificity anything. So, for example, if you remember the movie Minority Report,
Yeah,
there were
pre-crime.
these, yeah, pre-crime, exactly. So, these I forgot what they were, sort of these three sisters that were special oracles, and they could predict who was going to commit a crime. But that is impossible and will always be, because life is complicated and crime is complicated. And somebody might be tend towards violence and they have a bad temper and things like that, but it doesn't necessitate that they're going to commit a crime. So we'll never be able to really, in a meaningful way, predict that. As I said, though, it is clear that on the spectrum of the population, some people are much more violent than other people, and it's useful to keep a careful eye on that and watch for recidivism there and put people into training programs.
Can you rework circuitry? I mean, I guess we do know that redemption exists, so you can get people to not behave that way. Is it?
Not necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily. So take psychopaths that we were talking about before. Nobody has yet figured out what to do in terms of rehabilitative strategies for psychopaths. So what some people tried to do is say, look, what if we put them in a circle? Everyone sits on a folding chair and you're in a circle, and it's, let's say 5 non-psychopaths and 1 psychopath, and everyone talks about their feelings. And what happened was that increased the recidivism of the psychopaths. Why? Because the psychopaths would sit there and listen and think, oh, I didn't know people felt that way or responded that way when this happens. And it just gave them more ammunition to use against other people, as in, that's a chess move I hadn't thought about. So unfortunately, not everyone is equally rehabilitatable. And this is one of the issues with our legal system. And, I run what's called the Center for Science and Law. And it looks at the intersection between neuroscience and the legal system and asks the question of, what can we be doing besides imagining that incarceration is the one-size-fits-all solution? There are all kinds of rehabilitative strategies that we can do for some people and, not for other people. And there's different rehabilitation for different people. So it's actually a really interesting spectrum of, what you can do moving forward. But for some people, like psychopaths, there's really very little you can do at the moment.
I love the Center for Science and Law idea too, because it's using what you know to have a practical, application in real life. Hopefully, not do that one-size-fits-all punishment model that we seem to really celebrate in the West, for sure. You're involved in a lot of stuff. How do you know? How do you pick and choose what? And look, in this business, there's a lot of charlatans too. So how do you find out? In the wellness game is filled with it. They talk about using neuroscience. How do you figure out how to participate and how not to get in trouble?
It's an interesting question. First of all, the projects that I choose are the ones that resonate with me the most. I mentioned earlier, my father was a forensic psychiatrist, so I grew up thinking about the legal system and the differences between people. But I guess I would say if you're doing something meaningful, you never have to worry about getting accused of being a charlatan, because, I publish whatever. I've got, like 135 academic papers and 8 books. And, all the stuff is provable and online and, in peer reviewed journals. So,
but when you're coming across people who you for sure must not believe.
Yeah. I guess I would say, as much as publishing in journals is always a pain in the butt and getting grants is a pain, it's a lot of extra work, but it's probably useful as a system of filtration. So, if I come across someone who's, let's say, not published papers in peer-reviewed journals, that tells me something, and maybe I would look with a little bit more skeptical eye.
The thing that you said about dreaming, it stayed with me because we live in a world where people like to assign value to dreams. And when you said this, I remember thinking, fucking hell, that would. Yeah. And then you said we can't prove it because we can't just prove the opposite. But can you tell us what you think dreaming is?
Yes. Okay, so what really stands out in our brains, and this is true across the animal kingdom, but especially with humans, is the amount of plasticity that we have, meaning the brain's always reconfiguring itself. Okay. So what we know, for example, is that if somebody goes blind at birth, the visual cortex at the back of their head gets taken over by other sensory areas, by hearing, by touch, and so on. So the system is, quite fluid in terms of what the territory is coding for. Okay. Well, here's the surprise. In 2013, some of my colleagues at Harvard did an experiment where they blindfolded people and put them in a brain scanner for 1 hour. And at the end of the hour, they started to see that the visual cortex was responding to sound and to touch. And so you could see little responses in the visual cortex, which means that the beginnings of that takeover were more rapid than anyone ever thought it could be. And my student and I were looking at this, and we started thinking about, what does this mean that we live on a planet that rotates into darkness for half the time? And obviously during evolutionary time, before the invention of electricity, it was really dark when you rotate into darkness. That puts the visual system at a disadvantage. You can still hear and touch and taste and smell in the dark, but you can't see. And so we realized that every night the visual system is in danger of getting encroached upon by the other senses. And so what you have is this very ancient circuitry that goes across the animal kingdom that blasts random activity into the visual cortex every 90 minutes. And because we are visual creatures, we experience that as a visual dream. But that's all dreaming is. And if you look at the circuitry, you've just got these midbrain neurons, these very ancient neurons that are just blasting activity right here into the back of the head, and that's it. It's not going anywhere else. And so it turns out dreaming is just the brain's way of defending the visual cortex against takeover. It's a screensaver. And what happens is whatever synapses are hot from the day, those tend to be more activated, but the constraints for how the information flows, it's not particularly strict when you're asleep. And so, things go off in weird, bizarre plots. And then, of course, we wake up and we say, my God, this thing happened, and we assign meaning and we make interpretations and so on. But it's actually just random activity to keep the system going.
I told this to a couple of friends of mine, and they refused to acknowledge it because they put so much value into it. I talked to an astronaut, a very well-known astronaut, who told me that being up in space for a long time, he believes in some kind of God. I've talked to some physicists who believe in God and some who do not believe in God. Knowing what the brain can do, knowing what happens to people on ayahuasca and mushrooms, what do you think about the human capacity for spirituality and what might be out there?
Yeah, we're clearly geared for spirituality. What's interesting is that we are so limited in what we can understand, let's say about the cosmos, that, for example, I was just out in my backyard watching a squirrel, and the squirrel's running around, and he ended up running on the power lines above. And I thought, wow, he would just never be able to understand what those lines are, the telephone lines, and there's people sending information at almost the speed of light in zeros and ones. And that way I'm tapped into every other human on the planet, and we're doing all these things. Like, it's so far beyond what he could understand with his little squirrel brain. Obviously, the thought is, what are we? For what creatures are we like the squirrels, where we can't even begin to understand, to imagine what is going on with them, their literature, their concerns, their philosophies, and so I wrote this book of fiction, which is all about, it's 40 short stories, all about this kind of thing, about what could be going on in the universe. And obviously none of them are meant to be taken seriously, but what is meant to be taken seriously is shining the flashlight around the possibility space and saying, wow, there is so much that we don't actually know. Let's not pretend that let's not, first of all, fight and die for our particular religion that we grew up with. On this little planet, we have 2,000 religions. And people, generally are willing to fight and die for whatever arbitrary deity they happen to grow up with. Let's think bigger about what's going on.
So it's this word that I first heard applied to you is possibilism, or this. It's like we don't.
Possibilianism, exactly. So I started this movement called Possibilianism back in 2009 after I wrote Some. Yeah, exactly. And essentially, it's saying, look, on the spectrum from atheist to fundamentally religious. there's not enough evidence for either of those points. Let's see if we can get off that little spectrum and open up to a wider space and use the tools of science to rule parts out of that space and to open up new folds in that space that we hadn't even thought of before.
Dude, now we're hearing stories about. I'm not cynical, but my critical thinking skills are so finely tuned to not believing what I hear and when they come out. So you hear about unidentified objects now. You hear about they might just time. We don't understand time. All this other shit, and that when you get deep into the cosmos, I think I heard Brian Cox talk about this too. It's like we're not all experiencing this in the same way. And I just wondered, for someone who spends so much time really understanding behaviors, what you make of all of this conversation that we're having now.
Yeah, I mean, what all of this points to is how little we know. Some years ago, I said on an interview that what a life in science really teaches you is the vastness of our ignorance. And that's great. I think that's one of the most important things to having a more open mind is, first of all, really understanding how little we know. I've spent a big chunk of my career studying time and our perception of time. And, it is this funny, wobbly, fluid thing. When you're in danger for your life, you think things took longer, and other times when you're bored, things seem to move faster and so on. I've done a lot of studies on this. And, when I talk to my physicist friends about the way that time changes based on your frame of reference and so on, what seems clear is that the little parochial neighborhood that we've grown up with on the Earth just tells us not that much about what life is in the cosmos. And as I said, there may exist creatures or whole civilizations that are so much bigger than us, that are to us, that we are the squirrels to them.
Is it true that maybe your whole journey this way is because of your understanding of time when you fell off a roof?
Yeah, that's right. That's how I got into neuroscience, is I fell off the roof and it seemed to take a long time, and I got curious why that was. And no one had ever done a study on that. So I ended up doing the studies, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to let you go. I know you got to go. But the last thought is, if science is funded by corporations, does that change the way we should look at corporations? And we'll sort of look at the science, the ethics and all that. This is because, during COVID, suddenly no one trusted scientists. Well, a whole bunch of people suddenly don't trust scientists anymore. They connect them to who's paying and all this other stuff, and the journals. So when you look at it now from your perspective, is there a pure way to go forward, and what happens when money comes in?
Here's what I would say. Money is always directing science, and that is whether it's corporations or governments funding it. There's, money going towards nuclear physics leading to a nuclear bomb because that was important. If other things are important about the agriculture, about weather, whatever, then the government will put money into that and not into other perfectly, equally good projects. So science funding is always biased in that sense. The good news is that, one can do lots of science on one's own. Just as one example, Isaac Newton did essentially all of his stuff, revolutionized math and physics and invented calculus and did all kinds of, by the time he was 26 in his, room doing this stuff. So there's lots that can be done without kowtowing to what a corporation or a government wants you to do.
Right. Dude, I'll let you go. I appreciate it, Doctor. I look forward. Let's do this again down the road. I have lots more questions.
Can't wait. All right, George. Thanks. Great to see you.
You too, bud. Talk soon. Okay, bye.
All right. Bye.